Thank you for the introduction. Let's see, so once again, I also need to stay here, right? I'll try to behave. So you'll probably notice this interesting cover photo that I have here. So I decided to steal this title for my talk from my wife, Eva's blog that she shares on her experience and I guess our experience transitioning here to Lithuania from the United States. So it's called Into the Forest I Go, and I feel particularly fortunate today because my wife Eva is actually just sitting here. Maybe you can wave. So she decided to join us today for the talks and hear about women in biotech in Lithuania. And I guess I had this joke prepared, but I don't know if it's quite as funny as I thought, but I was just going to say thank you all for excusing my Y chromosomes today. So let's see, I just need my pointer, I think, and then I'm prepared. Thank you so much. So yes, so this is going to be maybe a little bit different. There'll be some science at the very end, but I want to just share some of my story with you all, and I guess in some ways our story. And so from what I was told, this year's focus has been on transition and transformation, and so I'll start my talk telling you all a little bit about my transition to Lithuania, as well as my transformation from team member to team leader. And then I'll share a little bit with you about what I believe is going to be next year's focus on diversity and inclusion and some of the ways that I've practiced that with my team and in my experiences thus far in science and biotechnology. Oh, and then I'm going to share with you a little bit about my team's research and the vision for our research. So, I was fortunately able to find a perspective of the globe that has everywhere that we've lived so far, or at least that I've lived so far, on one side of it, so that was fortunate. But I wanted to just introduce you all to a little bit of my scientific background. So I grew up near Boston in the northeast part of the United States, and perhaps like many of you, I was itching for the opportunity to get away from home. And so for me, that was heading to just the sort of one of the more southern points in the US to Florida, where I was at Florida Institute of Technology, and I was studying fertilization and signal transduction in starfish. And we chose starfish because as you all know, they're able to, say, regenerate arms, and in some of those arms are also their ovaries, and so you can take their eggs and use them for science, and they'll just make more for you, which is really helpful. And then after that, I moved from Florida to Brown University in Rhode Island, one of the, we'll say, smaller, but not the least of states in the United States, where I was studying microbial pathogens, and this is actually, what you're looking at here is Candida albicans, which is one of the yeasts that are basically on all of our skin, but they can also cause yeast infections and other undesirable conditions. And you'll also notice here that I don't have a master's separately here, and I'll just mention that to people who aren't familiar with the United States education system, but oftentimes the master's and the PhD are done as a single, we'll say, academic pursuit rather than as two separate events. And then when I moved to Austin at the University of Texas, I first began there by studying epigenetics and aging in individual cells, and also spent some time working on a project with some scientists in the physics department where we were working on different strategies for storing digital information in DNA as a long-term storage substrate. And of course, as Monica mentioned, I then moved on to designing high-throughput biochemical strategies, specifically those that could be used for understanding CRISPR and other gene editing tools. And that's actually what I founded my research team here in Lithuania on at the Vilnius University Life Sciences and EMBL Partnership Institute. So probably a big question for you all is, why would we cross an ocean? I know for a lot of people here, they see the United States as sort of like a aspirational place to go to. But as far as we were concerned, there were many reasons why other parts of the world were also interesting to us. And so here's just a few of those reasons. So the first, which I already mentioned, was that I was already alluding to, was the science here. And so when I decided to come to Lithuania was right when Vilnius University and the European Molecular Biology Laboratories had formed an agreement to begin a partnership that focused on my area of research, genome editing technologies. And so this was building on the strength that Lithuania already has in genome editing technologies, and also brought in the strength and recognition of the European Molecular Biology Laboratories, which is one of the largest scientific organizations in the world and is held in very high esteem across at least the life sciences and in many way other technologies that are related. So really, it was sort of an exciting proposition scientifically, and certainly was very much in the running just on that alone. But there were a few other things that were important to us, one of which is this balance between work and life. So I'm sure we see this in the media and elsewhere, but we recognize that there are a lot of places, and in our experience this was very much true, in the United States where there's not really a healthy respect for understanding how your life and is important to your work and also your work to your life, and understanding how to bring them together so that you can sort of achieve everything that you are aspiring towards. There was also some political elements there. So for both Eva and I, we find that our morals and our beliefs are much more aligned with the typical European country than they are with some of the American ideals that are unfortunately broadcast around the world, whether we like it or not. So that was really an attractant. And then finally, Eva and I and our dog Audrey are all adventurers, and so the opportunity to be able to experience another part of the world, another culture, meet new people, see things we'd never seen before, I guess motorcycle across continents if you count this summer, those things all seemed really attractive to us. And so this sort of all came together to really inspire me to take the plunge, and for, with Eva's support, to start my laboratory here in Lithuania. And I should mention, Monica and I were talking about this the other day, but one thing that was really important that I had learned from we'll say my past mistakes, is that whenever you're making a big change in your life like this, it's really important to have not just the agreement of your partner and the others in your family, but if at all possible, enthusiastic consent and agreement, because this is major life change. And so just as a little story, we actually had a friend that had asked Eva, said, imagine, your partner's not here, and if you had to choose between all these different places where he has job opportunities, where would you most like to live? And she had actually chosen Lithuania, which was really a huge sort of vote of confidence for me, and so that really helped me sort of make that last little jump there. So those are the reasons why we decided to cross an ocean. Of course, there's the question of how do you actually do that, and I mean, we all know, how transportation works and everything, but one of the things I wanted to mention that was really helpful for us and might be helpful for other, say, companies that are here if you're trying to attract international talent from outside of the EU, is the European Blue Card. And so this is a special type of residence permit that's available to people that are not from the EU, but makes it much easier to make the transition because there are different, say, rules around where you can buy property, where you can even start a bank account, sort of all these different things. And so that made that transition easier for us. And in many ways, this could be similar to, say, if you wanted to move to the United States and wanted, say, a job visa or a green card or something like that. And so it really helped make it easier for us. Although I do recognize that this type of, we'll say, privilege is not available to everybody, it was very helpful in our situation. And of course, the other how of that is that we had the support of people here in Lithuania and also at EMBL, as well as the support of my mentor at the time, Ilya Finkelstein, as well as the other members of our group and other mentors in my life. So just the encouragement that we needed. I actually wouldn't even have known much about Lithuania were it not for the fact that Ilya had gone to the CRISPR conference that was here in 2018 and came back sort of singing its praises. So it wasn't the first time I had heard it when I had seen the job advertisement. And then also here in Lithuania, there's organizations like Go Vilnius and International House that really did a lot to try and make sure that our transition here was smooth and that we had the information and tools that we needed so that we wouldn't get stuck on the silly things that might prevent us from otherwise succeeding here. So then, I also remember during my interview, they had asked what my, sort of like, what would what's important to bring here with you. And I sort of had a fairly short list. So there was basically Eva, our dog Audrey Sparkles, as well as my motorcycle, the one that we took to Italy this summer. That was really nice. And so this, remember, was during the pandemic just a couple years ago. And so here's Eva and I in the airport with Audrey right here inside of a crate that I had built because she's a greyhound, so she's very tall and skinny, and apparently the normal crates aren't good enough for them. So, but either way, that was us in the airport making the transition that you can see here in the red color, with just a short stop in Houston and then Frankfurt before arriving in Vilnius, whereas all of our goods, including my motorcycles, took a bit more of a 3-month route that included many more ports that, while it might have been interesting, was certainly not nearly as quick as the flight. So yeah, that's a little bit of the how. And then next what I want to do is share with you a little bit about sort of like some of the different things that both I and Eva have noticed. I'll try not to speak for you too much, but just things that we've noticed between these two countries and maybe some of my thoughts about them. And so the first is that when I was in the United States, a lot of the industries are fully developed. There's a lot of existing infrastructure. And for that reason, I sometimes felt like just one gear in a much larger machine. But one of the things that's sort of exciting to be here in Lithuania is that in many ways I see this country and this sector as very much aspirational. Like, we are going places, we want to do things, we're striving to get there, and so I feel more like I'm on a rocket ship, and that's certainly a much more appealing place to be for me, despite my love for mechanics. Another difference that I see is that in general, and this relates to that work-life balance, is that there's very much a hard drive for productivity, and a lot of times other parts of people's lives get sacrificed for that purpose. And I personally don't find this as a very healthy way to live the life that I want to live. And so one thing that I like about Lithuania is, while there is still a drive for productivity, there's understanding things like the other members of your family, maybe whether it's your parents, children, significant other, that they are also a priority in your life as well as your health. And so so I think that's much better understood here, and I think actually the United States could do well to learn a little bit more about that. One of the things that I see in the United States that I think Lithuania could improve on is actually, in general, I find that the United States is a bit more accessible to people with disabilities. So I had a friend that was here recently for the NATO summit, and they were saying how much of a struggle they had finding a hotel that actually was able to have a visitor who is in a wheelchair be able to access the room that they were supposed to be sleeping in. So the US definitely is a bit further ahead. Maybe that relates to the litigious qualities of the United States that might have caused this to happen. But in general, sort of related, I also see I think there's a bit more of a concern in Lithuania about our health as human beings, and so I think that the population here, at least from what I see, is a bit more fit, and also, healthy. And then also related to that, when we talk about data, I think that's true too. So I think I feel more secure here, whether it's with my personal data or with even with our home. So one thing that we remarked on when we first moved here was just how few police officers we saw compared to our experience in Texas, yet the crime levels here are so much lower. You know, when we first moved here, we were living near Kalvarijų turgus, and people said, oh, that's a really unsafe area to be in the city. And it's like, this is a walk in the park, don't you worry, you know. So that's also really nice. You know, like the fact that our new home has an alarm system, like what is this even here for? But maybe, I hope to never find out. And something that was mentioned earlier with our other speakers, who, by the way, I really enjoyed your talks and really enjoyed what you all had to share, is that there's, of course, more funding opportunities available in the US. And that's why, you know, I talk to Monica sometimes, and I hear about her running back and forth. And of course, you know, while those funding opportunities are more present in the United States, it doesn't mean that they're only for US companies. And so that's something to be aware of. But the other side of that is that when you're in a smaller country like Lithuania, is that some of those players are more accessible to you. So you can meet and talk to those people, and that can be really helpful, especially at meetings just like this one. And also, I think it can lead to a more agile community. So basically, we can make moves and changes as we need to with the times in order to make sure that we're doing our best to be at the leading edge of these different industries and experiences as they're happening. And as many of you probably know, of course, around the world, people do desire to come to the United States. I think, that was something that was a little surprising for us, is that we don't, even though we are now the international people, we still had a lot more international scholars, for example, at my prior universities. And I know that's something that we're working on here. But on the other side, I do see a lot more international coordination in my day-to-day life here. So this idea of actually building scientific collaborations or business partnerships across national boundaries is definitely alive and well here, and I appreciate that. And then the last couple things I'll share on this slide is, for the United States, I also recognize the US has more visibility and, of course, a much larger market share, so that impacts businesses a lot. And the other piece that I mentioned when I was talking with one of you earlier is I also think there's a bit more of like a marketing and sales culture that sort of just permeates throughout the United States. And so this idea is like, whether you're at work or not, somehow you're always selling something somehow. And I think to some ways that ends up being an advantage in certain parts of our life, because we're already comfortable advocating for why we think something is good and knowing like what language is useful or convincing there. And that's something that I try and help others with now that I'm here in Lithuania, because I see some great ideas that are just not getting the headspace that they deserve. And then last two things I'll mention about Lithuania. So one thing that's a little bit bothersome at times is the bureaucracy here. I realize that is a very cumbersome thing, a very big load on people here, and also something that I know people are working to change, but it is, imagine that, a slow process. And then the last thing for Lithuania is, in general, in my experience, the enthusiasm for science, both within my circles and just in the general public, seems to be much higher here than what I experienced in the US. It might not help that we were in Texas, which is not always known for its progressive policies. But either way, I really love that about being here in Lithuania. When I tell people I'm a scientist, I don't, get told to go back to hell. Instead, people ask, oh, cool, what are you studying? All right, let's see. I'll figure out how this thing works again. Here we go. So we often get this question too. So do you all plan to move back to the US soon? And so the answer here is no. This alludes to what Monica was mentioning. And that's because for us, the positives of being here are far outweighing any negatives, bureaucratic or otherwise. And so there's the answer to the question. You don't need to save it for the end. All right, so now we'll move on to a little bit of a discussion about transformation. So the biggest transformation for me recently was just basically this movement from being a team member to being a team leader. And so I wanted to do that with as much information beforehand as possible. And so I was very fortunate at the University of Texas, where we had a lot of tools and opportunities available for gathering skills. And so it's probably a bit of a long list, but I think it's really important just to recognize that being a leader, as much as you can just jump into it, it can be a bit more efficient if you get some of the information you need beforehand, perhaps learning from other people's mistakes. And that's me also being well aware that making your mistakes yourself is a very efficient teacher as well. But some of these things are not exactly what you would attribute to a research professor, but have definitely been very helpful for me. Like understanding a bit about marketing, like I was talking about earlier. If we have good ideas, how do we sell them, That was probably one of the biggest contributors, I feel like, for being able to get this starting grant from the ERC, is that we had these ideas, but we also know how to share them with people in a way that they can say, I like that. I want to be part of that. And when you can do that, you can sort of really change your experience, whether it's in science or elsewhere. And also this one at the bottom for mentoring is really important, because that's my favorite part of being a scientist. And I realize it's not just, it's not only in academic science. Of course, many of you that are in business have these opportunities to build these mentoring relationships that can really change people's lives. And I just really love that. Another part I've found of being a leader and being a good leader is actually caring. And a lot of times that means you have to care at many different levels, right? So I care for my team members, but also for the health of the team as a whole, our institution, other members of the staff and the administration, and then as well as our larger community, whether that's the university, Vilnius, Lithuania, whatever it might be. Because much like levels of organization in organisms, oftentimes you have to make trade-offs between these different things, and having an understanding of how they relate to one another, and how sometimes if you make a decision at the team level, which is healthy there, might sometimes have an impact on an individual member, but just recognizing sort of what that relationship is, and having sort of that long-term perspective. And then another thing about being a leader, right, is that you actually have to do things. You can't just say, I'm the leader, and then suddenly expect everybody to follow you. It doesn't work particularly well. So you have to be able to envision and have a vision for what you want to do and what you want to achieve. Because if you're going to have people come along for that ride, they have to see that it's worth it. So, you have to have that dream there. So people say, yes, I want to be part of that. And I also find that it's important that when I want my team members to do things for me or for the team, that I also model them myself, right? So if I'm not willing to do something, then why would they be willing to do it, right? It's a little bit different when you're working with students, because it's not like, well, you don't get a paycheck then. It's like they are still going to, the money is not the incentive there, right? And so you really have to recognize there's these other ways that you can bring people into the team. One of the other ways that I do that is also advocating for my team members and of course, for our science in general. So the idea here is that sometimes I have a voice that others might not have, and if I can use that voice for good, it can go a lot further and be, of course, much more valuable to those on the team. And of course, these last two sort of go together, so communicating, standing here in front of a crowd of you all, or wherever else it might be, and also representing. So just realizing that every time that I'm someplace representing my group or the university or wherever else, that I'm not just standing here for me, and so being aware of that and making sure that I'm acting in accord with what I think is in their best interests as well as my own. I also just want to give one more shout out too, because I forgot to mention one of my team members is also here today. So Fausta's all the way in the back, so if you want to, I just put you on the spot, I apologize. Anyway, if you have any questions about this stuff, she might be able to tell you how it works out in practice. And maybe she doesn't agree with me, but hopefully she does. So one of the things that I try to do in my laboratory and with my team is recognize that if we want to have a certain culture on the team, we actually have to cultivate that. Because oftentimes, it's just, what do they say, nature abhors a vacuum, right? Is when there's nothing growing there, other stuff will come in, and you might not like what's there. So really this is, if you want to have a culture on your team that is something that you value and others do too, you need to actively work towards that and really recognize that some parts of the culture really have to be advocated for and displayed right from the very top, or else it won't happen. And another piece here is just to recognize that I know I'm in a place of privilege as a leader of my group, as someone who's gotten to travel across the globe, as someone who gets to lead a research team in the things that we find interesting. And so what I really try to do is when I have the opportunity to use that privilege that I have to advance others. And so I'll touch a little bit more on that later. I realize I have no idea how I'm doing with time, and so if there's an issue, please let me know, but otherwise, I'll carry on. And one small piece I wanted to share from what I do with my team is that we have a social contract. And so this is something where anyone that joins our team, we have an understanding of what we can expect from one another so that we can know sort of what we're getting into and how we can count on one another for support. And so this is sort of the short list without the details, but I thought I'd share it nonetheless. And what you see at the very top for both my team members and for myself is to be a good person. And I realize that's a very simple sentence that is a little amorphous, but really it's just this idea that before you're a scientist, before you're a CEO, before you're an entrepreneur, whatever else it might be, that you need to start from there. That should be your foundation, right? Because how many times do you get into a situation where you go to meet someone that is maybe someone that you have always looked up to, and then you find out that they're terrible, and you're like, well, never mind. I've had that experience with musicians many times, right? You have a band that you love, and then you see the person on stage, and you're like, wow, I wouldn't even want to spend a minute in a room with that person. Taking ownership of their education, I think, is important for my students because I recognize that while they're going through their training, that they really have to learn how to sort of have that motive force within themselves if they're going to succeed, whether they stay in academia or go into industry or whatever else. Working on their professionalism, acting as a team player, and also doing their best to become a stronger researcher are also part of that social contract that we have. I realize all of you are capable of reading, yet here I am reading this list anyway. So as I've mentioned before, leading by example, assisting them in their education, not doing it for them, right, but realizing that if they need help with a specific task, that I'm there for them, training them in their scientific research, and then finally, being an advocate for them. There are many times when whether we're new to a company or perhaps we're just starting our studies, where we notice something that maybe isn't quite right, and our voice isn't heard for some reason. And so for those of us that are privileged with a position of power, it's really our duty to listen and to make sure that those voices are heard. So I really try to do my best to do that for my team. Okay, then I have a headline up here, so anyone who knows me might have heard me say this before, but I like to say that science is an international sport. And I put it in brackets here because you can also, of course, replace that with other words, but just the idea that it takes all kinds for us to really achieve our scientific goals. So this is sort of a soft transition to that discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I have a thing here I won't really mention, but it's just a statistic there that might be helpful for some of you all. I want to just now talk a little bit about what it means to be a diverse team or to have diversity within a group. And so I think a lot of us are very well aware of what inherent diversity is. So these are the attributes that we're born with. These are things like our gender or our race, perhaps where we were born. And so these things don't necessarily change over time, but then we also have our sort of acquired diversity. So maybe some of us have had the opportunity to live internationally, or some of us have a further education than the others, or perhaps we are from a more wealthy class, or have been able to transition to a more wealthy class. So those things can also provide diversity that can be helpful for providing your team with some of the things I'll mention in a moment. But the other thing is this idea of inclusion, right? So how do we take people that have all of these different diverse experiences, whether when they were born or through their life, and make sure that they can all come to the table, right? And so that's the inclusion, making sure that we can fill in these gaps, right? So that everybody's here, and so that we can benefit from the innovation and progress that can come from the perspective, the enthusiasm, the providing of a comfortable space, maybe the strategies or connections that are afforded by having people from different places, from different backgrounds, from different experiences. So I'm just going to mention one other thing here because it sort of reminds me of when I was a child. You remember when you're a child, everything's about being fair. You know, if your sister or brother gets an ice cream, you get an ice cream. If they got to go to bed at 9 p.m., you go to bed at 9 p.m. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. You want the exact same thing. And what I really loved, so when I was in Texas, I was part of a committee that was really focusing on diversity and equity and inclusion. And one of the things is this idea of equity instead of equality, right? This idea that we recognize what people have, what they don't have, where they're coming from, and really working to fill in those gaps, once again, so everybody can come together and really make the biggest contributions that we can possible. So how does this look as on my team? I don't like to boil this down to numbers, but one thing that I think is kind of cool is, as you might expect, we have people at different levels of education. I won't put the details of what the colors mean because it's not important. We have some of those that have had international experiences and some that don't, some that are from within Lithuania or not, and then also men and women right now. We don't have anyone that's non-binary, but nonetheless, that's the distribution in our team. And so what that looks like when we look at faces and how people interact with each other is you can see most of the teams here, and we have a few others that either were not there for picture day or whatever it might be. But I hope what you can see in these photos is that these people are generally happy to be here and be part of the team. And that's because we work towards making sure that our laboratory is a place that people want to be, because I find that generally when people want to be, a place, they're there more often and can achieve things that they wouldn't be able to do by themselves at home. And so what do we do in my laboratory? This is the transition to science. What we do is that we seek to develop next-generation gene editing tools. And in order to do that, we try and use high-throughput strategies that allow us to profile enzymes, their guides, and their targets. So I realize not everybody here is really in the field of genome editing, and so I decided to first remind you of what we can do with these tools, and then how do they work a bit. So the thing that's really great about these gene editing tools is that they enable a lot of high-value technologies. So these are technologies that allow us to have new medical interventions, allow us to do new types of research. They also allow us to make and engineer crops that can help us meet our sustainability or climate goals, and also allow us to perform diagnostics, including for things like the COVID pandemic. So they're really useful technologies. But how do they work? Well, I'm going to try and simplify this and also work with the most basic enzyme that you will hear, and that is this CRISPR nuclease called Cas9. So Cas9 is an enzyme. Enzymes are typically made of protein, but this one's kind of special because it sort of has a best friend. So Cas9's in the blue here, and there's this pink thing here. That's a piece of RNA, and that's actually what tells the CRISPR nuclease what to do. And so what happens is that this CRISPR nuclease, Cas9, and its guide RNA here, are able to move around inside of the cell, inside of the nucleus, and look for DNA, which I'm showing here with the double helix, that matches the sequence of that RNA that has programmed the Cas9 nuclease. And what happens is that when that guide RNA in pink is able to match and sort of link up with the proper DNA sequence, that tells the enzyme that it's now able to do its job. And so what that job is for Cas9 is to actually cut the DNA, because once we cut the DNA, then we can make changes to it. It's far easier to do that when it's separated than when it's still together. But the observant in the crowd might have noticed that tearing DNA apart does not necessarily change its sequence, because you could always just glue it back together and everything would be perfect, right? And so what happens is that the final step, which is the repair process, is typically done by other machines that are within our cells. And what they can do is sometimes remove some of the DNA, maybe change some of its sequence, or if we give it the right additional tools, add additional sequence in at that site. So there's sort of different ways this can go. But either way, in the end, what you typically get is some sort of change to that genetic sequence, maybe in we call it your favorite gene, YFG, whatever it might be, so that you get what you want. Of course, this is not a foolproof process, and many of these different parts of the system have a little bit of wiggle room. And we need to understand that wiggle room, or like basically what their flexibility is, if we want to understand how we can use them most effectively and safely. And so what we do in my lab is that we try and develop these high throughput technologies that will allow us to understand as much as we can about these tools as efficiently as possible. And so what that looks like right now, I realize I might have a different definition of high throughput than you all do. But at least on the enzyme front, we're working on technologies to allow us to test tens to hundreds of these enzymes all in parallel, and understand how these different guide RNAs, so here we're looking at up to tens of thousands of guide RNAs, how their different sequences and shapes impact their ability to tell these enzymes what to do. We're also looking at many, and by many I mean about millions or more, depending on the situation, of DNA targets, so different things that they could act on, and trying to understand how do they decide whether or not this DNA is one I should operate on or not. And so we have technologies that we're that we have already developed, as well as some that we're working on that allow us to do this. And then finally, the lamest one, I admit, but we're working on developing these technologies to work in different environments. So that things that we figure out in the test tube, we can see how well they work in the cells that we want to engineer, especially when those cells might be within a whole organism. So that's just a little bit of an introduction of what my team does. I now mostly do the orchestrating, and they get to do the pipetting, which at times I'm very jealous of because I find it very therapeutic. But if you want to hear more about what I do, hopefully I'll get to see some of you on Thursday at the Life Sciences Baltics Conference. So there I'll really go into sort of the nitty-gritty of what we do as a research team, and it might get a little more in-depth there, but hopefully that little chat was a nice primer for what you'd hear there. And so with that, I just want to thank my whole team and all of you here in the audience for listening, as well as our collaborators and our funding sources. And I also just want to say that if you're interested in either collaborating with my team, or perhaps if you could see yourself working with us, that you go ahead and take a drive by joneslab.eu, where you can learn about our research and connect with me. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll take any questions.